Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today's show is all about Recovery Dharma. And so I'm pretty excited to share this episode with you. I've been interested in this program for a while now. And today, Amy and I talk about Recovery Dharma as an alternative to the 12-step program. Recovery Dharma is definitely not your grandfather's recovery program. It is based on Buddhist principles, and Amy and I talk about how Recovery Dharma is similar to AA, but also how it's different. And there, as you can imagine, there are probably more differences than similarities. But you could definitely utilize both programs at the same time. This is your recovery, so you do what works for you. Okay, on to my guest, Amy Reed. Amy Reed is an Asheville, North Carolina-based writer. She got sober in Oakland, California in 2008 in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and dabbed a little in Buddhism via Kevin Griffin and Spirit Rock. When she moved to Asheville with her family in 2014, she found herself drifting away from the 12 steps and struggled to find a recovery community in her new town. Then she saw a flyer for Refuge Recovery in a cafe, went to her first meeting in the summer of 2016 and found exactly what she was looking for. She soon started a dedicated meditation practice, became active in her local and regional refuge community, and was elected Asheville's Inter-Sangha Treasurer. In 2018, she was invited to join the Refuge Recovery Literature Committee and became part of the team that co-wrote and would eventually become the Dharma of Recovery, the first literature offering of the Recovery Dharma program. In February of 2019, she joined the Refuge Recovery Board of Directors. On July 13th of 2019, Amy represented the newly formed organization Recovery Dharma at the State of the State address at the Refuge Recovery 5th Annual Conference in Chicago, joining Noah Levine and outlining the two new organizations that have been born from the dissolving of Refuge Recovery. She is currently on the core transition team of Recovery Dharma and has been busy behind the scenes helping to build this new grassroots movement using Buddhist practice and principles to end the suffering of addiction. Okay, here we go. Amy Reed, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I wanted to talk about your spiritual background, sort of how I like to start all of my conversations, from childhood.
Yeah, so I didn't really have much of a spiritual background. I didn't grow up in a church or with any kind of dogma. My dad is a devout atheist, and definitely the kind who is very judgmental of people who do have spiritual practice. And so I grew up with that on one side. And then on the other side, my mom, who grew up in a Pentecostal Filipino church as a child and was very, very involved in the church. And then sort of, I think in her adult years, kind of went away from that, but she still had a belief in something that wasn't really super defined. But I spent a little bit of time in an Episcopal church as a child because I sang, and that was the best choir. So I would go and go to the choir practice, and we would put on these fancy robes and go sing at the services. And I really loved it. I loved the ceremony and the beauty of it. But there was really no kind of really spiritual understanding of anything. And then I also had like these strange experiences where I kept having these friends who would try to save me and like take me to their churches and like because I guess there are a lot of churches that you know, want the kids to go out and save the other kids that they think need saving. So that happened a few times. I never really bit, I guess. But I think that I kind of always had this sort of deep desire to like have a deeper connection to something. And I didn't really know how to define that. And then I did end up getting sober in AA. And I wasn't one of those people who had a problem with like the higher power concept, even though I didn't necessarily believe in like an omniscient sort of ever like powerful God who like had any opinion about anything. But I did kind of have an understanding that there was like, that I wasn't the center of the universe. And that was sort of all I needed to kind of get started in that program and that sort of form of recovery. And then later found Buddhism to kind of perfectly align to kind of my deeper sort of understanding and kind of view of how things work and how to like live a life of integrity.
Yeah. So I do want us to talk about Recovery Dharma. That is why you're here today. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your recovery journey, just to kind of give us a little bit more background.
Yeah. So I first went to rehab when I was 16 years old. I had started using when I was around 13 and just like kind of was one of those people who was immediately an addict. I think that I was, like so many of us, had some trauma, had dysfunctional family, had like all of those ingredients to just kind of set me up to kind of go straight into it. Like I found the solution for my pain, or so I thought. And then, that solution quickly became its own problem. And I was sober for about a year and a half as a teenager. But, I guess I hadn't gotten to the point where I felt like I had done enough research, I suppose. And so I spent the next, 10 years or so doing some more research and got to the point where like it just was not working for me anymore. I did everything I could to do sort of like harm control and sort of manage my life the best I could. And I got to a point where like, okay, so I've done all the managing and I still can't quit.
Yeah.
And then I ended up going to treatment again at age 29. And luckily it stuck that time. And I became very involved in AA in Oakland, California, and developed like an incredible group of friends in recovery. And it was a really special place to get sober. I think I was really lucky in that the kind of culture that I found in AA, there was a niche there for people like me who like, we weren't super into like a traditional sense of the higher power. We were like critically thinking, a lot of us identified as atheist or agnostic. And we just sort of like made that program work for us. And the most powerful thing for me and I know for a lot of people was just the community and like not being alone anymore. And more than anything, I think that's what really got me sober and like learning how to trust people again and learning how to like be in relationship and be honest and all of those kinds of things. And then at around 5 years sober, I moved to North Carolina and tried to kind of do AA here. And it just didn't click for me. I was not finding my people and I wasn't hearing things that resonated for me. I think I kind of reached a plateau in my personal growth and my emotional sobriety. And I felt like there was more and I just wasn't getting it in that program. And so I started kind of drifting away. I didn't really have a recovery community and then saw a flyer for Refuge Recovery, which is a Buddhist based program of recovery. And I started going to those meetings and really found like this sort of Buddhist approach to dealing with craving and just like being human, that was really, it just felt like truth to me.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of my introduction to like Buddhist recovery. And then over the next few years, there was, a lot of transition in that program. I was on the board of directors for a brief time. And then that program dissolved and 2 new programs came out of it: Refuge Recovery World Services, and then Recovery Dharma, which I'm on the sort of temporary transition team of that until we elect our first board of directors. And so that's my primary program now.
Is Recovery Dharma.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I just want to highlight a point that you said a little bit ago where you talked about being in Oakland, California and going to AA. And even though you didn't subscribe to a higher power necessarily, you still found your people and it worked for you. And I hear that often, that it's not even so much AA or the principles behind it. It's just about finding the people that work for you.
Yeah. That's definitely been my experience. And I think for a lot of people, they go to AA meetings or NA meetings and they're not finding their people. And that makes such a huge difference, because I think like, even though I think for a lot of folks who don't necessarily have a belief in a higher power, you can kind of suspend that part if it feels right for you, like socially. And that's where you kind of can put your attention and focus on the things that work instead of the things that maybe don't work for you. But if you don't have that foundation, like the community foundation, it's a lot harder to really feel like you have a place there.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. So, Recovery Dharma. Tell me a little bit more, tell the listeners a little bit more about Recovery Dharma. I don't know a ton about it. And when we were talking a few minutes ago, before we hit record, we talked about the Four Noble Truths, and maybe you could talk about some of the principles behind it.
Yeah, so it's basically, it's a program of recovery that's based on the Buddha's teachings, like the kind of basic Buddhist teachings that really are accessible to anybody. You don't have to be a Buddhist. There are a lot of atheists and agnostics who follow a Buddhist path because it's incredibly practical, and it's based on like a sort of psychological understanding of like the motivations we have for being human, and the basic idea that like in this life there is suffering, and that suffering occurs because of craving, essentially, because we want to attach to pleasure and we want to run away from pain. And like that's basically the definition of addiction, right? And it's also the definition of being human, even if you don't necessarily have substances as part of your struggle. We all struggle with craving, and we all struggle with like not wanting to feel our feelings and doing whatever behaviors we can to kind of numb out, or, you know, surround ourselves with pleasurable things that end up being temporary and leaving us again with that space of like, oh, I'm empty. What do I do now? And so really like the path that we follow is just based on the Four Noble Truths, which are that one, there is suffering, and suffering is caused by, you know, aversion to pain and attachment to pleasure, and that there is a solution to this suffering, and the solution is in this path, which is the Eightfold Path. And basically, like that path is just all about like wisdom, and it's about like being conscious of your intentions and compassion and generosity and speaking wisely and kindly, and a big part of that is meditation and learning how to just sort of sit with yourself and actually just like be with your feelings and pausing so that you can, wisely respond to them rather than like reacting in your habitual sort of behaviors. And so it's really just like, it's a path for integrity and self-compassion and compassion towards others and honesty. And we have a book that you can find on Amazon. It's also available for free on our website for download, because it's really important to us as a organization that it's accessible to everybody and that nobody, like no person is making a profit, that this is truly, a grassroots, peer-led, community-oriented program. Yeah.
Yeah. So that sounds really good. What would you say to the people that don't have any idea how to meditate or where to start? I mean, is that something that you have to have knowledge of prior to going to a meeting?
No, not at all. There is like no prior knowledge of anything required. A lot of people find us who have never like even heard of Buddhism. They just want something besides those traditional fellowships that they just don't quite fit in. And also, I just want to add too that like a lot of people in Recovery Dharma are also part of other fellowships, and that they find, this path is like how they practice the 11th step. And so, yeah, like when you go to a meeting, there will be a guided meditation. You don't have to like know how to do anything. There will be instruction, and there's so many great resources online too. Just like, how do you start meditating? And there's so many apps that like have guided meditations. And it's really just, like, I think we can make it really complicated, and we can have like all these expectations of like how you're supposed to do it, right? And really it's just about making space to just like be quiet and still and listen and be with yourself, and stop chasing for just, a few minutes a day, and then maybe a few more minutes next week. And just like giving yourself that gift of stillness.
That might be the only time a person stops and is still in their entire day. I can imagine that to be true.
Yeah, especially in our culture, which is so built around running, being busy all the time. Like addiction is built into our culture. It's in everything we do, like the way we relate to media and like all of those things. And so it's a great part of what I love too about Recovery Dharma is that it's very inclusive and holistic in how we approach, how we think about addiction. Like we don't compartmentalize, alcoholics go over here, drug addicts go over here, eating disorder people go to this other meeting. Like it's inclusive of all people who want to end the suffering of their habitual behavior. And so we have people at meetings, who struggle with addictions and who struggle with eating disorders or struggle with codependency or just anxiety in general and like obsessive thinking. And so it's really a place that's there for anybody who wants support and community around, healing from whatever they need healing from.
Yeah, I love that.
Because I mean, I don't know about you, but like, I don't have just like one addiction, right? Especially in long-term recovery. Like I don't deal with cravings for substances anymore, but like, oh my gosh, like so many other things pop up. Like, social media and stuff with food and stuff with relationships. It's like, our brains are designed to attach to something constantly. And so it's great to like have this sort of broader understanding of like, how am I really dealing with the suffering of my mind and really like enhancing my spiritual growth and my emotional sobriety in like all of these like really deep and like intricate ways that like I wasn't really getting in programs that like all we talked about was drinking. Because at a certain point, like drinking isn't my problem. anymore, but my mind is my problem.
Yeah. So did we go over all 4 of the Noble Truths?
Yeah.
I feel like I may have skipped a couple. Okay.
Yeah. So that it's basically like 1, there is suffering.
Okay.
2, suffering is caused by craving. 3, there is an end to suffering. And 4, the end to suffering is the Eightfold Path. And then I think I kind of breezed through the Eightfold Path, but basically it's wise view, which is just sort of like seeing clearly, like seeing the truth. Kind of, how do we get out of delusion? And then wise intention, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, wise effort, and then wise mindfulness and wise concentration. So like that, those last 2 kind of deal with meditation, like, mindfulness and concentration in meditation, but also in how we approach life in general, right? Like, can we be mindful in as many moments as possible? And can we focus our intention on what is true and important? So they're all practices, right?
Okay.
They're not like commandments. They're not like, thou shalt not do this because it is a sin or whatever. It's like, here are tools to like live a good life and to like wake up. And so there's no like dogma or judgment or shame. It's just like, this stuff is really, really useful. And like, if you do it, you'll probably like improve your life a lot. Yeah. So there's like a lot of hope there.
Yeah. And also, with AA, you're not working the steps concurrently, or in conjunction with, like, I'm not going to work steps 1 through 3 at the same time. Right. So it sounds like with Recovery Dharma, you can be working on multiple pathways to recovery, or you should be.
Yeah, it's not there's no linear sort of thing, or like, graduate, it's, and actually like the symbol of the Eightfold Path is a wheel with 8 spokes. So it's, it's a circular thing. Like, you're kind of doing all of them at every moment. And when you like can truly feel balanced is when you're putting the same energy to all the 8 spokes. And of course, that's a very tall order, right? But that's kind of the intention, right? Is to find that balance and to find that the middle path in how we approach things.
Yeah, I love the idea of the spokes on the wheel. And then if you stop attending to the spokes, the wheel falls off the car, people.
You end up in a ditch.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Okay. So I want to talk, maybe you could sort of lead us through what a Recovery Dharma meeting looks like. So I know you said in the beginning there's a meditation, and it may be different for everyone, for every meeting, but maybe just like generalizations.
Yeah. So I think, every meeting is autonomous, and so they all have their own sort of personality. But in general, I think they'll usually start with, kind of intro announcements and readings. Like, there are kind of standard readings that we have that are like, this is the path and this is what we do here. And then there will usually be at the beginning, like a 20-minute guided meditation. And we have some meditations as part of our program that folks use at various meetings, like, like just a basic breath meditation, or like a metta or a loving kindness meditation where you're sending out, friendly, kind thoughts to yourself and to others, to kind of build up that feeling. And there's like compassion meditation and equanimity meditation and like appreciative joy meditation. And then there are other ones like mindfulness of the body or mindfulness of, feelings. And so there are a bunch of different meditations that people kind of cycle through. And then some meetings after that will have like a speaker speak on a topic for like 10 or 15 minutes. Or a meeting that I love that we have in Asheville is a Dharma study meeting. So we'll play like 15 or 20 minutes of a Dharma talk, which is in the Buddhist world, that's kind of like, it's like our version of a sermon. Although that word, is really problematic for a lot of people. So try to let that go.
Forget she said that.
But it's like, so it's like, like a Buddhist teacher will give like a lecture on a concept. And so like we will play like 20 minutes of one of those lectures, and then we'll have a discussion about that afterwards where people can talk about that topic, or they can talk about what's going on in their recovery or whatever. What are some other ones that I've heard of? There are meetings who are like, it's an inquiry study. So part of the program is working on inquiry. So I guess like it's like, it's like the equivalent, I think, of doing like a fourth step or like, that kind of like inventory work. But I think in our program, it's a lot more holistic. Like we're really looking at how we've created suffering in our lives through our behaviors, and how can we apply the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path to relieve that suffering. And so some meetings will kind of like focus on a certain inquiry question or something like that. And so there are different sort of like formats, but they generally follow that, like, announcements, meditation, some sort of like starting kind of share or something, and then open for discussion, just like you would find at most recovery meetings. Yeah. And so it should feel like somewhat familiar to people who are used to like AA or NA. The only difference is there's a meditation.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're not hearing just about one substance. You could be hearing about several different substances, or maybe there are several different obsessive thoughts that people are having, or So it's interesting that in Recovery Dharma, it seems like addiction isn't linked to a specific thing. It could be anything, which I find which I like. Yeah.
Yeah. Cause the source is the same for all of it, right? It's always about like, how are we trying to avoid pain and how are we trying to chase pleasure? And we do that in different ways. Like I find now in kind of long-term recovery, my main addiction is control. And like, how do I like, what are all the behaviors I attach to like trying to be in control? And so I find a lot of wisdom in hearing from people who have had like restrictive eating disorders, because I like really relate to that approach to like, I find pleasure in feeling control. And like, so I really get a lot of wisdom from people who have struggled with that in that like particular way, which is not something I necessarily would have expected. But so yeah, like I find it's just a beautiful thing to like create this community that's so wide in its support, and where we can learn from each other in ways that we might not have expected. And that it feels like the inclusivity is really, really powerful. And the fact that we don't define ourselves by like our one substance that was maybe our favorite one, that we are part of a larger community and a larger human experience that has room for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that inclusion piece as well. And that's how the Recovery Dharma, well, I think it was called something else, but that's how it started, correct? It was because Noah Levine didn't want to walk into a meeting with a bunch of people that looked like old white therapists. And so I read that somewhere and I thought, oh, that makes sense. Yeah. So,
but we do have some old white therapists in our meetings, and we love them.
Yeah, I would be considered one of them. So. And I definitely want to come to a meeting. So.
Yeah. Well, where are you in Virginia? I think there's a few meetings up there.
There are.
Yeah. I forget. Yeah, we'll talk later.
Okay.
And so then. Oh, I was just going to say that we have a meeting directory online on our website, recoverydharma.org. And I think we're like around 400 meetings now, all around the US, Canada, UK, some in Australia. And then we have an online community also that does online meetings, which is really, really great for people in like, especially like rural communities who we might not have a presence there yet. And our online community is really, really strong. And so, yeah, like you can look on the website and look at the directory and see where your closest meeting is.
Yeah. So if you couldn't get to a meeting, maybe you would go to something like an AA meeting, if you felt comfortable doing that, and just to kind of get you through, and then jump on an online meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So you could kind of work both of them.
Yeah. That would be... A lot of people do that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Great. Well, Miss Amy, any other final thoughts as we wrap up today? Anything else that you want us to know? Or
I think that like I don't know. I've said a lot about what I love about our program, and I think one of the other things that I want to mention is that we're really trying to be intentional about being trauma informed and being inclusive of different identities that traditionally haven't felt safe in AA and NA and other fellowships, because I don't know. I don't want to like trash talk those, because they I mean, I got sober and they saved my life. They've saved so many people's lives, but I think like because they are so based on very, very old, a very old foundation, and that hasn't really caught up with the needs of certain communities. There are certain communities that just don't feel comfortable there. And so we're really, really trying to make an effort to create safe spaces and to really understand trauma as part of addiction, because obviously, like, you're a therapist, like everybody knows that like trauma is the root of addiction for so many of us, and that isn't something that I really felt was addressed in 12 steps for me, and that I've found so much healing and like growth now, like kind of integrating that into my recovery, and just like, you know, attachment issues and like all of those things and how that affects how I relate to other people. And so that's something that I am very, very passionate about, and very excited about, in that like we really are trying to make that central to our program, so that we can create a safe healing space for anybody who needs it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great place to stop. So, Amy, where are some of the best places to reach you and or Recovery Dharma? How can people find out more?
Well, I would start with our website, which is recoverydharma.org. It's recovery. Dharma is spelled DHARMA. So recoverydharma.org. And then we have a really active Facebook group. So I think if you just type in Recovery Dharma, you'll find the group. And there's a lot of really great conversations happening there and a lot of support there. You can kind of see what the news is and what else. I think those are the main places to get information. You could, if you have like specific questions, I would first kind of try to ask them on the Facebook page. Okay. Or you could also email us at info@recoverydharma.org. But the Facebook group is a great place to start conversation and build community. And there's a lot of folks who are active on there. Okay. And yeah, like check out a meeting. There, you don't have to know anything. You don't even have to identify as necessarily an addict. They are places that are really open to anybody. And our book is available on Amazon. You can also, like I said, download it for free from the website.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on. I've taken notes like crazy, and yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.